It's not just the price of oil and natural gas outside North America that have gone up. Also, refining margins have been incredibly high through the month of March, and both Exxon and Chevron indicated that they ran the refineries very hard through that period. So I think that that is one of the key reasons that the results have been as good and surprising to the upside to Wall Street.
We've been hearing from the administration. President Trump met with the head of CENTCOM, and it seems like they want to stick with this blockade. I have two questions for you. How much pain is this actually inflicting on Iran? And talk to us about the storage issue. The administration says Iran is running out of storage. Is that real or not?
Well, starting from the first part of your question, it's inflicting quite a lot of pain because Iran effectively is losing around $175 million a day in lost income from the oil revenue, from the oil exports. But the key question is that enough for Iran to come to the negotiation table with an offer that is good enough for President Trump? And the answer potentially is not enough. Iran made quite a lot of money for the first 2 months of the war, where it was able, and the U.S. have no problem letting Iran selling his oil. So in some way, they have some money that they cash in the early days and weeks of the war, and they can use that extra money that they made to cushion the current blow. On the question of is there going to be any long-term damage to the oil well, my view is no. First of all, Iran is still loading oil into tankers. It was on Friday, according to satellite pictures that we were reviewing at Bloomberg, loading a super tanker at Kar Island. So that's an indication that Iran still has access to tankers that they were inside the Persian Gulf when the blockade started, and it has onshore storage. So I don't see Iran having to start reducing production at the earliest until probably the middle of May. And will that cause some damage? Probably not. And even if there was some damage, will be that really what is going to prompt the Iranian authorities to come to the table with an offer that President Trump is satisfied? Again, I don't think so.
In the midst of this ceasefire, how much production is Iran able to do? Just give us your vantage on the degree to which oil production in Iran continues apace.
Well, if we look at crude oil and condensates, Iran was producing around 3.5 million barrels a day, exporting about 1.8 million barrels a day. The rest goes to the domestic market. So Iran needs to produce somewhere between 1.7 and 1.8 million barrels a day just to keep the country fuel. Perhaps the demand now in Iran is a bit lower than otherwise because of the destruction of the war, because people are not traveling, because mobility is down. But Iran is a big oil consumer on his own, so a significant chunk of his production goes into the domestic market, and then the rest of it goes to the export market. At the moment, Iran is loading still tankers, but those tankers cannot really reach the high seas. They are stopped by the U.S. Navy. That's where we are today. At some point, they will run out of tankers. They will need to start storing the oil onshore into tanks, and at some point they will have to reduce production, shut down the wells, shut in the wells, as we call it in the oil industry. That moment has yet to arrive.
You said Iran probably has to make those decisions starting at the end of May. What about other big producers in the region? Are there any other producers that you think are nearing or will near their storage capacity and start to throttle back potentially sooner rather than later?
Well, every other producer in the Persian Gulf have already maxed out their storage capacity. That's what production in places like Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar has completely collapsed. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates continue to produce oil. That's because they have bypass pipelines that they can bypass the Strait of Hormuz, reach the Gulf of Oman in the case of the UAE, or the Red Sea in the case of Saudi Arabia. That's the reason that they keep producing, but everyone else in the region have to take those decisions to shut in oil wells in the very early days of the war. And no one really at the White House is talking about the Kuwaiti oil fields exploding because they have to be shut down. I think that this focus on Iran having a particular problem is misplaced. Everyone in the region produce oil from a very similar carbonate reservoirs. Yes, perhaps the the Iranian oil fields are older and have some low pressure and has been under sanctions, don't have American technology. But the Iranian petroleum engineers have been very creative over the last 40 plus years to keep those oil fields running despite everything.
You mentioned the UAE. UAE saying sayonara to OPEC Plus, which is meeting this weekend. So I imagine those members are going to lick their wounds and then try to plot a path forward here. What does that look like? How does OPEC Plus move on from the UAE going its own?
Well, on the short term, nothing changes because with OPEC, with the UAE leaving, but they cannot increase production because the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, and the UAE is already maxed out on the bypass pipeline that they are using. So short term, nothing changed. Medium term, if the Strait of Hormuz reopens, the UAE will start increasing production. There will be demand for those barrels because we are really running down the world's oil inventories, both on the commercial side and on strategic inventories. Everyone is going to have to buy extra oil to replenish those inventories. But we were wondering where that extra oil was coming. Now we have a bit of an answer. That extra oil probably is going to come from the UAE. Long term, that's a more difficult one. I think that the UAE keeps increasing production. I put Saudi Arabia on a corner. At some point, Saudi Arabia needs to decide, say, mid of 27, early 28, do we want to reduce production to keep prices higher, or we just join the United Arab Emirates? And that also, other members in that cartel are going to be thinking, are we taking the right decision, staying with the Saudis, or should we follow the UAE? And I think that we are going to see over the next few months other countries starting to talk quite openly about potentially leaving the cartel.
That was my question, is if you look at those OPEC members, especially the ones who do throttle production. I mean, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, Libya, Nigeria pretty much produce at capacity most of the time, but those who are really those big players have to be watching this very closely. And can Saudi hold this together? If you were going to pick the next potential defector out of OPEC, who would be your bet?
I will say two names, one on the OPEC Plus group, on the big alliance. I will be Kazakhstan. They are acting like they are out, but they are keeping inside because of the relationship with Russia, and because probably they say, well, we're gonna produce as much as we can. We are cheating all the time. Better to cheat within the group, and we get some of the information and some of the upside. We are free riding effectively the cartel. But can Kazakhstan at some point say goodbye? I think that as a candidate. The other one inside OPEC, and one of the founding countries, and one where the U.S. has a lot more influence, Venezuela.
Yeah.
The government of Delcy Rodriguez says that they are staying, but at some point over the next 12, 18 months, I will hope that we will see democratic elections in Venezuela. If that election turns to opposition government, the opposition historically has been hostile to OPEC, and then we can see Venezuela leaving. And that will be a big deal because it's a country that wants to produce more oil, that is going to have probably the investment to produce more oil, and it was one of the founding countries of OPEC. That will be a big deal. That will be the first departure of one of the original founders.
Mm-hmm.
Javier, last question for you. Iran is doing all of this right now, and there is talk, I know, of finding ways to reroute oil going forward in the future. How long is that likely to take? How real is it that there could be kind of a whole new infrastructure built here in the next years or decades to get oil out of this region?
Well, you don't have a lot of permitting fights in Saudi Arabia. Usually the Royal Palace decides to do a new pipeline, they just do it. The original east to west pipeline, that is the one that we are using at the moment to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, that's the one that runs from the Persian Gulf in the east of Saudi Arabia to the west coast into the Red Sea. That was built in the 80s in 4 years. And that's when they have to build the whole line, do all the earth movement, all the difficult job. So I will think that 4, 5 years max, we see a lot more pipelines. So we have this odd situation. We are at peak of the influence of Iran on the Strait of Hormuz. They have never had a grip on the Strait of Hormuz as they have. But just because they are having that grip today, that grip over time will be weakened, because more countries in the region will build bypass pipelines. I'm sure that Saudi Arabia will increase the capacity of their east-west pipeline. I'm sure that the UAE is going to do the same. Key question is, does Kuwait build a pipeline, and if so, through where? Probably south to Saudi Arabia and then across to the Red Sea. Do other countries, Qatar build his own pipeline, perhaps through Saudi Arabia? That's politically more complicated. What Iraq wants to do has options through Syria, has another option through north to Turkey. There's already a pipeline there. It will be a question of expanding. So the region's pipeline politics are going to get really interesting over the next few years.